Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Mike J. Mike is a writer who's written extensively on the history of science and medicine, with a particular focus on psychoactive drugs. His books on the subject include Emperors of Dreams, Drugs in the 19th Century, High Society, Mind-Altering Drugs in History and Culture, and Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic, which is what we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Mike J. Mike, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, pleasure to be here, James.
So first I want to start by thanking you for writing this book, Mescaline, that you wrote recently. It's really, to me, it comes across as kind of the platonic ideal of a book about mescaline. You really, it's very kind of scholarly and thorough and very entertaining as well. But yeah, so I want to start kind of asking you what led you to becoming interested in mescaline in particular.
Right. Well, I've been writing about the history of drugs in different capacities for quite a long time. I think it's probably like getting on for 20 years since I first started researching and digging into the bit of this story that first interested me, which was the kind of the period in the 1890s, the sort of transition between of peyote from Native American and indigenous culture into Western science. And which a fascinating episode, and I think probably still the core of the book. And I was, and it was that, and I was, I've been nibbling away around that, and I'd not really thought about writing an entire history of mescaline because it seemed to me to be kind of too difficult. It was actually my editor at Yale who said, how come there are all these books about the history of LSD and the history of ecstasy and there's no book about mescaline? And I said, well, it's a big, long, complicated story. It is, as I say in my subtitle, it's a global history. So a lot of the literature is in French, or it's in German, or it's in Spanish, or even Polish and Romanian. A lot of it has never been translated. You have to wrap your head around a lot of very complicated 20th century science, as well as, as I said, what I think at the core of the book, once you go back into it, is, the cacti and indigenous cultures. So it seemed to me like kind of too much for one book, but my editor went, no, you can do that. So I thought, okay, I'd give it a go. And as a result, it's, I think it was a good time to do it because the sort of the psychedelic renaissance that we're engaged in has a story of its history which is very short, and people say, well, psychedelics kind of suddenly appeared in the 1950s, and then kind of they were studied for a bit, and then Timothy Leary, blah blah blah, and it all went wrong, and now we're finally looking at psychedelics for the very first time. So what I really wanted to show at this point was that mescaline, in its cactus forms and its and its synthetic forms have been present and played very, very different, diverse roles in culture at different times and places in the Western and non-Western world. So that I thought it was kind of time to try and give a big picture of that.
Yeah, it's definitely very timely, and you achieved your goal of tackling this vast terrain of material very well. And so to begin at the kind of earliest time point, I suspect so we're talking here about, as you say, cacti that contain this chemical mescaline, the most famous of these cacti being peyote, this kind of very small button-like cacti, and then San Pedro, these very tall, very different looking cacti. And so you have this art from the Andes that's thought to be is about 3,000 years old, depicting San Pedro.
Yeah, it's at a site, a temple site called Chavin up in the Peruvian Andes, which I visited several years ago, and that's kind of really the first bit of cactus iconography we have. There are also remains of peyote from around that time and earlier. But I kind of started with Chavin because right in the center of the old pyramid complex, there are these bas reliefs of a lot of figures, particularly figures transforming from felines or jaguars into humans and back again. And one of them is holding what is very obviously a San Pedro, a big stem of Huachuma cactus. And if you go to the site today, there's San Pedro grows everywhere around it. There are huge, great stands of it. It's up on the Altiplano, very windy up there. A lot of people kind of plant it as sort of windbreaks and hedges around the place. So, you're obviously in territory where it's kind of been used in all kinds of ways by the people who live there for a very long time.
Right. And you mentioned as well there that it's also called Wachuma, right, in the kind of indigenous language, which is a name people might
Yeah.
see today. And then you also write about kind of Native American people whose culture still uses these cacti, including peyote. And there's one in particular, the Huichol, who you write about. Some people believe that their culture reflects a kind of direct through line of this kind of unbroken chain from these ancient traditions. And there was a particular bit you write about that they have this this belief in a kind of a trinity of deer, maize, and peyote, which I thought was really fascinating. And you said in particular that might be a kind of a cultural sign of the transition from hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where you'd be focused on deer, to agriculture, where you'd be focused on maize, and how peyote kind of transcends that. I just thought that whole thing was fascinating. What are your thoughts on the whole kind of Huichol culture, and if that's continuity to the kind of ancient Andean San Pedro use?
Yeah, that's Barbara Meyerhoff's theory. She was the first person, one of the first people, anthropologists, to embed herself with the Huichol and to go on their famous annual peyote pilgrimage. And that was the way that she theorized it. I've written about the Huichol in the book, mostly through the perspective of anthropologists, and trying to get a sense of how this has looked to Western culture, how we've very slowly come to understood it, and how our perceptions have changed. It was with the North American Plains Native American Indians that I actually kind of did my field work. And that's also partly because the Huichol have kind of become, well, I guess the two things that they're really famous for are the peyote and their art, which often has peyote motifs in it. But I think it's kind of, lots of people write about them from the perspective of their peyote use, and they've become, the people who give a charter to our modern idea of psychedelic culture. And it seemed to me that to do that too much was really to do violence to their beliefs, which peyote is central and important, but it's only one of many other things. As you mentioned, the deer and the maize, and there's so much else going on in peyote culture, in Huichol culture, that I didn't want to kind of. I really wanted to use that to look at how we as Westerners have approached this and tried, often failed to understand it. I've spent a bit of time up in north of Mexico in sort of Huichol territory, and I'm fascinated by their culture. It's got this incredible aesthetic beauty to it, and it seems to be. I mean, they were people who, when the Spanish originally arrived, they retreated into the very, very distant, mountain, the canyon country of the Sierra Madre, and kept their culture intact. And that's why they now do this peyote pilgrimage, because they go back to their original peyote before the Spanish. So you're certainly looking at something, which is indigenous and pre-Hispanic. And unlike a lot of the many tribal groups in Mexico, Huichol people tend not to, wear t-shirts and jeans and go out to work. They kind of really live their culture. So you're clearly looking at something that is ancient. And a lot of people have sort of projected onto that this must be something very pristine and very ancient. But I think even just looking at the 20th century, you can see how much Huichol culture has changed. If you look at their art, for example, how it's changed in the last 100 years, I think that, I think it's, I'm reluctant to kind of project too much onto them and go, this is the spirit of indigenous America, because I think they reflect a lot of those themes, but at the same time, they're their own people.
Right. And so you mentioned the kind of Spanish colonizers who were the first people in the West to document the use of peyote. And you describe these kind of two different modes the different groups have. One of a kind of I guess like divination, where the curandero or shaman would take it and help people solve their problems, and then another one which is a more kind of ecstatic singing and dancing group use, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's I think what we call divination is, I mean, healing in a way is a subset of that. I think we've tended, particularly Western sort of people from a medical background, have kind of looked at this and gone, other people are, and sort of seen this as a type of therapy. But I think if you try, generalize, I think you'd say that peyote and indeed kind of these what we call psychedelics in indigenous cultures are they're conceived as being things that sort of change your energetic level and raise you up onto a level where you can see things that can't normally be seen, and you can interact with entities or other persons who you can't normally interact with. And this is the way that divination works, I think. A lot of these kind of one-on-one sessions that you see with peyote and with wachuma are dealing with questions like, probably the most common one is, lots of bad stuff has happened to me. Have I been cursed? Has somebody put a curse on me? What's going on? But it could also be, I've lost my wedding ring, or it could also be, my sister's gone to the big city. I don't know what's, is she doing okay? And the question of I'm sick, what's wrong with me, is in a way one of those questions that in the same way, the power of the cactus is to allow people to see, what's normally can't be seen. And that's the causes of sickness, which are invisible. And of course, in indigenous views of the world, they're not biomedical, they're spiritual. So healing is kind of a form of divination. And that kind of consultation is carried on, particularly in Peru with wachuma these days, with sort of curanderos. And it's kind of conceived, and that again, that's something else that presumably has ancient roots, but it also has a lot of sort of modern and lots of Catholic trappings and lots of other sort of modern innovations. And that's kind of seen as a sort of collaboration between the cactus, which is a person, and the patient and the curandero, working together to try and figure out what's going on. So I think, that's one way in which the cactus has been used for, way back. We don't quite know, obviously, in exactly what form in kind of pre-literate times, but it's recorded by the Spanish as soon as they arrived in Mexico. And the other way, which is also recorded by the Jesuits and the early missionaries in the 17th and 18th century, is something that's much more communal, where a whole community, often a village, would get together, often at night, often round a fire, often with singing and dancing, and taking the cactus through the night. And, that was pretty much stamped out by the Mexican Inquisition, but that's another that you can see appearing in other indigenous cultures in the region.
Right. And then you have this, you mentioned, so you have the Spanish coming, and there's a bit great in the book where you describe how they came with cinnamon kind of offering to the native people, and then the native people had kind of peyote and psilocybin mushrooms and datura, morning glory seeds, this whole kind of pharmacopoeia of the most powerful mind-altering substances in the world. And then you have this kind of, I guess, a move towards, because you have this Christianization as part of the process of colonization, right? That you have this, they come up against these indigenous religious practices, and especially things like referring to the mushrooms as the flesh of the gods. I guess they were confronted with, what do we do with this, right? Can we bring this into alignment with Christianity? But it seems that it went in the direction of prohibition, right? Of seeing it as sinful and kind of heretical.
Yeah, I mean, the Spanish obviously were coming from Europe at the height of the witch craze, accusations of devil worship and demons everywhere. So particularly, those of a sort of strict religious disposition, the Jesuits saw that everywhere where they arrived in Mexico. and they were very. There were other people, at that time, like like Sahagun, who wrote a lot of the sort of early treatises, who was much more curious about the natural history and what was going on here with these plants and mushrooms and cacti, and did they have spirits in them, or were they poisons? And what all of them had to deal with was the extraordinary similarities between, sort of visual similarities between indigenous Nahua, what we call Aztec religious practices, and the Catholic Mass that, as you said, they called mushrooms the flesh of God. They burnt copal incense, just as the Spanish burnt frankincense, and they took their sacraments with their head bowed, muttering prayers. So, what was this? What relation did this bear to European Christianity? And many of them felt that this was a kind of mockery by the devil, a sort of satire, sort of making fun of the natives. But the question was kind of whether, this could easily be just transferred across into Christian worship. And the answer was it could and it couldn't. In some ways it was quite simple, for Wachuma, for example, to be renamed San Pedro. And a lot of, indigenous people in the New World were very, very happy to take on these, names of saints, because Christianity obviously had great magical power. So why not put your cactus under the protection of St. Peter, as well as everything else that it was already under? It seemed like a win-win. But I think what they didn't really get was this insistence that it had to be, Christianity was exclusive and couldn't coexist alongside other ways of seeing the world. So what they were so it turned out to be extremely hard to extirpate all these services. They kept on finding out that these sacraments, these cacti and mushrooms, were being used in secret, and the Jesuits write to each other saying how incredibly hard it is to get the indigenous people to give them up.
Right, and I think you also write about the kind of origins of modern drug prohibition in this phase, I guess, and the way that you have these kinds of racial and religious taboos, and this differentiating between the kind of civilized and the savage, with psychedelic plant medicine being kind of considered part of the savage.
Very much so. It's because the Mexican Inquisition prohibited peyote, and that's really the first kind of Western European prohibition of a drug, and it doesn't kind of It doesn't make it into most histories of drug prohibition, which start in the 19th century. Though, if you look at the 19th century, particularly at places like the Indian reservations, where the tribes are living in forced captivity, and peyote is prohibited to them, there's lots of doctors and medical and public health voices saying it's toxic, it's addictive, it's enfeebling, it's degenerating them. But there are also lots of missionaries on the plantation, on the reservations, who are, still explicitly saying we have to stop these Indians taking peyote because we have to rescue their souls for God. So I think, that strand kind of continues into contemporary prohibition as well. And I think it also drew a dividing line, as you say. It was when the Spanish prohibited peyote, it was, one of their main concerns was that the kind of the mestizo generations that were growing up with mixed Spanish and Indian heritage were using it often for divination and for curses and for magic and so on. And it became identified, as you say, with savagery and barbarism and opposed to civilization. And I think in a way that made it more of an important kind of touchstone for indigenous people, and than it had been before, in the same way that it was being excluded from the sort of new sort of white Christian ideas of civilization. That also made it a very powerful focus for nationalist movements and attempts at indigenous cultural revival.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting as well, this whole, whenever you, I think, call something a taboo or a sin or talk about saving people's soul, to me, that rhetoric comes in when people want to kind of basically make their culture the dominant one, but they don't have a kind of rational explanation, evidence-based kind of case against something. So with something like peyote, it's been used kind of medicinally and it has all these amazing kind of qualities. But because you can't win on that rational kind of front, you just have to say, no, it's bad. It's intrinsically bad in some kind of metaphysical way. And we see this continuing through. I mean, you write about how the UN Single Convention on Drugs, that, was the thing that kind of made modern drug prohibition globally the thing it is today, actually uses the word evil, you point out, in a way that no other convention does, which I found astounding.
Yeah, I think that's that was probably to do with the influence of the Roman Catholic Church on drafting all those anti-drug measures in the early 20th century. They weighed in on that a lot. But yeah, I mean, not far, beginning of kind of modern drug prohibition, you get lots of references to the opium evil and so on. And I think the way that those kind of prohibitions work, and the way that something like Christianity works in that's how you entrain people into the new system of civilization. That's how you educate them. You pull them into the church, and through that you socialize them, and they get to understand what the new civilized norms are, and so on.
Right. And then I guess the next phase is the one you said you were first interested in, which is the work of James Mooney at the end of the 1800s, this anthropologist. Can you take us through that whole kind of phase of mescaline and mescaline-containing cacti?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because this is how peyote finds its way into Western medicine and Western science, is through people encountering it in the American plains in the Southwest. Where it's recently become part of the central sacrament in a peyote religion. And that peyote religion had only just emerged at that point. It's not kind of, it's not ancient in that form. It really only came together once the Native American tribes were, confined, enforced captivity on the reservations. And they weren't, most Native American tribes had never encountered peyote because it only grows down in Texas and a little bit of the Rio Grande. So there were some Apache bands down there who had known about it for a while. But there was a lot of kind of cross-border traffic between Mexican and Plains tribes. But it was really only with the Texas railroad opening up that peyote started to move around and make it to those reservations. And so I think it's a fascinating story of how it gets adopted by that first generation of Native Americans in captivity, and how it becomes, as we said before, a real focus for their cultural survival and renewal. And it's in this context that James Mooney first encounters it. He's an ethnographer working with the Smithsonian Institution. And so he's fascinated by Native American culture. And he's one of a small handful of ethnographers who are out there studying it. This is the era of assimilation, when all the sort of, there's a sort of Federal Bureau of Indian Management, which is really all about, there isn't going to be such a thing as American Indians in a generation's time, because they're just going to be American. Right? So the children get taken away to boarding schools where they're taught Christianity, and they're not allowed to speak their native languages and so on. So this millennia of culture are just being destroyed. And Mooney's one of these figures who's going in there and trying to capture what's going on, before it disappears. And he comes across, is invited to a peyote ceremony in a teepee, and he straight away sees that this has got incredible possibilities for preserving the heart and soul of the culture, and he becomes a powerful advocate for it, both as a medicine and as a sacrament, but really, also as something that's going to hold the Native American tribes together. They're sort of collapsing in alcoholism and deaths of despair. And, really it's the Native American church and the strength that people are drawing from that that's keeping them together. So his mission is very much, one that's opposed to federal government policy. He's always, in Washington, speaking on behalf of peyote against, sort of Senate and House representative committees who are trying to ban it. And he has a ceremony with the Comanche chief Quanah Parker in 1893. There's a photograph he takes of this that I've included in my book. And he and Quanah then sells Mooney a big bag of dried peyote cactus, which he takes back to Washington and gives some of it to the university medical science department, and sends other samples to people who he thinks might be interested, like the neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell, and then Mitchell sends some on to William James. So there's just really this fantastic concrete moment. And it's always fascinated me about America at that time, that it's the Wild West, but at the same time, it's the beginning of neurology and modern science and medicine. And so this bag of peyote buttons that Mooney physically takes from Oklahoma to Washington, and in a way kind of brings these two parts of American history together. And it's the moment when Western culture and science really starts to try and figure out what's going on with peyote, and then, I guess, and generally with what we now call psychedelics.
Right. And is it around this time that Henry Havelock Ellis starts to get involved with this stuff?
Yeah. It's fascinating because everybody, at that time, scientists, if they were interested in mind-altering drugs, of course, you're interested in the experience that they produce. And of course, if you're interested in the experience they produce, you take them yourself. So it's a fantastic literature at this point, because everybody who's trying peyote is writing their own accounts of their experience. And one of the most influential early ones was by William Mitchell, the neurologist, who was also a novelist and a poet and a very good writer, and wrote a beautiful description of his peyote trip, which was read in Britain by Havelock Ellis, who was a doctor, but he was also an art critic and sort of progressive cultural figure who was fascinated by that kind of sensory world. He'd just written an essay about, the way that different writers, from Chaucer and Shakespeare onwards, used different colours and what they signified. That was, he was very interested in all the stuff across the arts and the sciences, and he was the first person in Britain to take peyote, and he wrote a short description of it for the Lancet, kind of really just talking about its sort of physiological effects, and then a much longer sort of very beautiful essay where he talks about particularly the visual aspects of the experience, and his hallucination and visual patterning and what he saw. And that's kind of fascinating, because you get this huge range. I think a much bigger range than we have today of, scientific and cultural reports on peyote. You get neurologists saying, what does this tell us about the brain and the relationship between the eye and the brain and the optic nerve? And you have philosophers like William James saying, what kind of experience is this? Is this like a mystical experience? But you also have figures like Ellis who are taking it as an aesthetic performance and almost reviewing it as you might a show at an art gallery.
Right. And this is a really fascinating time, right? I think this, I may have read this somewhere else, but I think Havelock Ellis was part of this secret society, the Order of the Golden Dawn, and I read that he gave some of his peyote buttons to the poet W.B. Yeats, who was also part of this kind of hermetic order. And then Aleister Crowley, the kind of occultist, was also part of this group, right? And he's another big figure in Mescaline history, right?
Yeah, that's right. Ellis wasn't a member of the Golden Dawn, but W.B. Yeats was, and they were friends. And they had a mutual friend, sort of decadent poet, Arthur Symons. And after Havelock Ellis took peyote, he gave some to Yeats and to Symons and wrote about their descriptions of it. He became very interested he decided he really wanted to hear music, and he gave some to a friend of his who was a musician and played music for him. And he was interested in all the synesthesia, the connections between the colors and the notes. He gave some to artists to see what it would do to their sensibility. Crowley kind of came along about, it was a sort of generation after this, sort of 15 or 20 years later. By the time that Crowley gets involved, this is sort of like in the early 20th century. Of course, he makes no mention of Yeats or Symons or anybody else. He kind of regards himself as the pioneer. But by that time, mescaline has been isolated from the peyote cactus, and Park Davis, the Detroit pharmaceutical company, had started marketing a peyote extract, and that's what Aleister Crowley uses. And he writes. Even in his private notebooks, he's very cryptic about it, but he makes a psychoactive magical potion which seems to contain it. He goes to Park Davis in Detroit and gets his own sort of special supply of strong tincture, and there are records of public ceremonies where he uses it and circulates it around. He calls it anhelonium. As with everything with Crowley, he kind of he has his own nomenclature, which developed from Louis Levin, who called it alonium. Everybody else had started calling it mescaline by that point. But Crowley writes a certain amount about it, and he writes at one point in his journal, The Equinox, that the next issue is going to contain a really good, full, long about peyote and mescaline and their use in magical practice. But he did write an essay of that kind about hashish, which is great. The one about mescaline never appeared, so we're kind of as often left guessing.
Right. And so you mentioned the kind of, I guess, at the end of the 1800s when mescaline was first synthesized. I think that's by Arthur Hefter, is that right? The German chemist?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And then you also write about how at this point it becomes what you refer to as a pure white drug, something like, how we see cocaine or morphine. And something I hadn't really thought about in the way that you write about it is the way that produced a kind of abrupt disconnect with the indigenous use, that you go from this thing that's seen as a kind of plant product to just this synthetic chemical.
Yeah, that's right. That happens to an extent with Arthur Hefter when he isolates mescaline from the peyote cactus, and he's by this time there are all the various descriptions of its effects, like Weir Mitchell's and Havelock Ellis's, about its the visual hallucinations that it produces, and how amazingly rich and beautiful and intricate and mysterious they are. And this is already, I think, very different from indigenous traditions. You don't really, in indigenous cultures, people talking about their experiences in quite the same way. That sort of first person thing of, I took this drug at 8:30 in the evening, and at 9:30 I started to notice little traces around my, all that, that's very much, that appears immediately, and that's that's very that's a very Western approach, and very, very different from the indigenous approach, which is much more that this thing, the peyote is a person, and it speaks to you, and it has a message for you, and why would you want to share that message? That's a wonderful private thing that you've been given. There's much more it would be much more questioned in indigenous culture. What would be your purpose for sharing your private vision? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to influence people? Are you trying to control them? In Western culture, immediately it's about trying to find the most precise way possible of identifying the drug effects and separating them from anything else. And so that starts right away with the isolation, but it's really in 1919, it's the synthesis of mescaline in the laboratory, which happens in Vienna. And then you're starting with an organic chemical and going through various different stages and then producing mescaline sulfate. And Merck Pharmaceuticals starts selling that as a research chemical. And then you've got this pure white powder that's really seen as a vision producing drug, and particularly taps into the fascination with hallucinations at that time, which are widely studied in what's just becoming psychiatry, but also neurology. How does this work? How can our minds, our brains generate these amazing visions from something, when there's no external input? Why do people suffering from the mental illnesses, particularly the one that's recently been named schizophrenia, have hallucinations? And hallucinations are quite hard to study at that time, because most people having hallucinations are either in psychosis or in a high fever, or can't really explain what's going on. So what's fascinating about mescaline for the first scientific researchers is here's a pure white drug that you can dissolve and drink, or more often inject, at a standard dose, and you can do this to multiple volunteers, and then they will start to see hallucinations, but they're also, a part of their mind will be quite coherent. If you say to them what's going on, they can describe these unfolding hallucinations in enormous detail. So that's really how it enters medical science, as something that gives special privileged access to this very mysterious and exotic mental phenomenon.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way that the Western approach heavily emphasizes the kind of visual hallucination side of psychedelics. And yeah, it's interesting to unpack why that is, because I think for a lot of people, they even hear the word hallucinogen, they think this is all about visual hallucinations, and then can be surprised at how much there is kind of stuff to do with kind of feeling and perspective taking and kind of ineffable insight and all this stuff that makes up a psychedelic state. So it's really interesting, the way that it also makes sense, as you say, that they want to quantify or describe this experience. And by definition, you can't really describe the ineffable. So I guess maybe that's why these psychologists and scientists focused on the visual.
Yes, the word psychedelic, in our culture now kind of refers to a very, a visual style. You think of fractals or op art or whatever, or maybe music, kind of, sort of flangey, sort of wibbly wobbly effects, or whatever. And when people, I've noticed when people describe their trips to each other, use a visual language to describe it quite often. They say, well, I started seeing this and that. And of course, if you've taken psychedelics, that, more often than not, that's the very, very least of it. But I think it's partly a handy shorthand, but it's also avoids a bit more of a sort of deeper question about how this makes you feel. And so I think there are various reasons why the visual has sort of come to predominate, but I find it fascinating, and the history of mescaline is so revelatory on this, just how that was how it entered Western culture from the beginning. That our Western idea of what trip is, which is so different from indigenous or non-Western ideas of what these states or experiences are, just how quickly that formed itself into forms that we can really easily recognize today.
Right. And then you have this research you write about Heinrich Kluver. There's a lot of, a lot of this centered on Germany, the origins of psychology and psychiatry. And I think you write about him studying visual hallucinations and suggesting that hallucinations might reflect something about the structure of the visual system, which is still kind of how we think about them today. And was it his book, Mescal, that was written in English that allowed it to kind of get into the wider culture?
Yes. that's particularly in the 60s. I mean, the edition I've got is kind of early 60s, University Press, with a sort of psychedelic cover, and that's by far the most common one. It was much, it was a book that was much more popular in the 60s than it was when it was written in the late 1920s. I mean, I think what was interesting about Kluver's work was that you had mescaline research generated enormous amounts of description, really vivid eidetic descriptions of people saying, okay, I'm closing my eyes and now I'm seeing these silver kind of circles vibrating and they've got violet edges to them, and now they're coming out of them, and there's hours and hours, and people generated enormous great sheaves of this. And this is what Heinrich Kluver looked at, and he said, okay, well, if you just forget about the descriptive interpretations, there are some certain patterns here that he called form constants, like the spiral and the tunnel and the cobweb. So and you do, if you take large doses of mescaline, you do just see those with open eyes, just superimposed over a white wall or whatever you're looking at. Interestingly enough, then when you go to sleep after that and you have dreams, they very rarely appear in your dreams. So it seems like this is something to do with, a physiological effect of the mescaline, and that this must be telling us something about the way that the eye and the brain form images, and these... he describes it actually, it's in the time before television, but it's like, he's almost saying it's like if you imagine you turn up the contrast, you turn up the brightness, you turn up the color, that's what you get. That's where you tend to get these kind of, opposing images, often sort of green and red or green and purple, and these sort of jangly sort of strobing lines and edges. So, he kind of, so he does a very good structural job. Obviously in the 1920s you can't get sort of really deep into the neurophysiology of this, but he describes these form constants, and his description has been very, that's still a strand of cognitive science that's that's widely applied to art history and to archaeology and to all kinds of other disciplines. But also Kluver himself said, I don't want to give the impression that just by describing these form constants, I'm describing the experience. Not. If you've had the experience, that these aren't just shapes. It's not just geometric grids and patterns. This all feels really profound and really meaningful, and can't really get to that through this kind of, psychological writing.
Right. And then is it at this point the kind of artists and kind of the wider community get involved with mescaline?
Yeah, I think because of, people like Kluver are realizing that there's a limit to what you can do in the lab, and it becomes, then people get interested in what would happen if you gave mescaline to an artist and got them to paint something? What would happen if you gave it to a philosopher and asked them about what was going on? So you start in the sort of 1930s to people start to reach outside the laboratory and outside the discipline of science to find thinkers and writers and artists and people who can, sort of give fresh insights into the experience. So there's a, and this is way beyond, way before the 60s or what we think of as the psychedelic era. But, there's a fantastic sort of body of literature and art from the early 30s of writers and thinkers on mescaline. So, people like Walter Benjamin and Jean-Paul Sartre, and a lot of modernist artists and surrealists. There was a great project at the Maudsley Hospital, a couple of psychiatrists there, very interested in hallucinations, and hired a bunch of British surrealist artists to take mescaline and draw what they saw. And that's an amazing archive of material, and a couple of them wrote fantastic accounts of that.
Right. And Richard Evans Schultes, who many think of as kind of father of ethnobotany, I think you write that he was also inspired by Mescal. Was he working around this time?
Yes, I think that was Richard Evans Schultes's entree was reading Mescal. He was at Harvard Botanical School, and he read Kluver's Mescal and decided that this would be a really interesting plants to investigate. So he went out with an anthropologist called Weston Labar to Oklahoma to study the use of peyote and the Kiowa tribe out there. And that was the beginning of their, after that he went to Mexico and found that he could identify a lot of these slightly mysterious sacred hallucinogenic plants that were mentioned in the old Spanish literature, and identified the what we now think of as the magic mushroom in Mexico back in the 30s, long before Gordon Wasson and the sort of 60s revival. So that kind of that opened up what turned out to be an incredibly important branch of ethnobotany. And it was, Kluver also, Ernst Gombrich, the art historian, used his work a lot to talk about, different styles in art in different periods and different cultural art history. And it's used a lot now by people looking at prehistoric rock art, and there's probably the context in which you're most likely to encounter it now. So it fed out in all kinds of productive directions.
Right, and then back on the kind of science side, it's amazing the extent to which psychedelics were influential in bringing the kind of modern biological understanding of the brain, as kind of as mental states as having a basis in neurochemistry. That kind of isn't really taught in mainstream education in these areas, just how much it was to do with mescaline and LSD and these things. But you write about Humphrey Osmond, who was developing this kind of neurochemical idea of what schizophrenia might be, that there's some substance like mescaline that he called M substance, right, which that's produced in the brains of people with schizophrenia, which we now know not to be true, but at the time was a kind of a very forward-thinking, I guess, way of thinking about the biological basis of the mind, right?
Yeah, I think that other drugs were very important. By the 1950s, psychiatry was starting to get much more biologically based and much more interested in pharmacy. Chlorpromazine was incredibly important, the first antipsychotic, because that switched hallucinations off. And once people started to pick that up in the 1950s, and then once people were aware of LSD and mescaline had been around, it'd been like, well, hang on, we can now experimentally switch hallucinations on and switch them off again. This drug turns them on and this drug turns them off. So there must be a chemical cocktail in the brain which is mediating this, which these drugs are mimicking. Humphrey Osmond, together with John Smithies, were the first people to run with this with mescaline, with the idea that what they noticed was that the mescaline molecule looked quite like the adrenaline molecule, which had been known about for a while, and adrenaline as a hormone was known about, and so they formulated a theory that maybe in some people's adrenal systems there's a kind of toxic reaction that produces something that's a bit endogenous mescaline. This is what they called M substance, and actually what we call schizophrenia is people's bloodstreams are full of this toxin that makes them hallucinate.
Right. So it was Humphrey Osmond, who we're talking about, who famously gave Aldous Huxley the mescaline that led to Doors of Perception. So now I think it's fair to say we're at probably the most famous point in mescaline's history.
Yeah, that's right. And also the point where the term psychedelic was coined, in the correspondence between Osmond and Huxley following that mescaline experience, because mescaline and LSD at this point were becoming quite well known in psychology conferences about them, but also in the world beyond. There were descriptions of which Huxley's was one of this people who'd been given mescaline or LSD writing about their experiences. And what bothered Huxley was that the terms that were being used to describe these drugs in psychiatry They're often called psychotomimetics because of this idea, as discussed, that they mimicked the effect of psychosis. And hallucinogens, they were often called, but hallucination was kind of a pathology. It's a symptom of schizophrenia and so on. So Huxley thought this was, the experience he'd had wasn't really, rightly compared to mental illness. It was much more, it would be much more appropriate to compare it to visionary experiences or the spiritual states reached by mystics. He'd just written that the Perennial Philosophy, which is an anthology of sacred texts from different traditions talking about, this kind of what he saw as a unitary, visionary, mystical experience. And he wanted a new name for mescaline and LSD, which took them out of the laboratory and out of the clinic and out of the mental hospital and into this territory that he was more interested in. So psychedelic.
Right. And you also write that, so there's a famous bit in Doors of Perception that really stayed with me when I first read it as a teenager, where he describes looking at his grey flannel trousers and he's captivated by them. And you write in the book that he was actually wearing blue jeans, which blew my mind when I read it.
Yeah, no, me too. It's in the sort of an early biography of Huxley, and it was his wife who read the manuscript of Doors of Perception and said, I think you ought to be a bit better dressed for your readers. And I think she was absolutely right. And I remember that from my teenage reading of Doors of Perception as well. And I think everybody remembers it because it's so great, the idea of this kind of tweedy, kind of British intellectual suddenly being astonished to be pitched into a kind of psychedelic experience. And that's really, I think, that the appeal of the book is, which I think, in contemporary terms, Michael Pollan sort of has done a similar thing. I think it's a great way, of popularizing psychedelics. Like Huxley, he's kind of he's part of the world, but not part of the world. And his pitch to the general reader is, I just thought that, this is just drugs and just crazy stuff, but believe me, I was astonished to discover that these experiences are really profound and meaningful and therapeutic, and I think that was Huxley's appeal as well. And I think the grey flannel trousers just caught that perfectly.
Right. Yeah. Someone being astonished by how trippy their tie-dye T-shirt looks doesn't have the same kind of effect, I guess. Not that he was wearing that.
Then it's like, well, of course he would say that.
Right. And so around this time, well, I guess, yeah, probably in the 50s, 60s kind of era, you have people, the kind of Beat Generation poets like William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg also trying these things. And also part of my teenage reading was Ginsberg's Howl, which I didn't realize the second part, he sings about Moloch, this kind of Canaanite god. And you say in the book that was actually, that inspiration came from a vision on Mescaline in San Francisco. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. He took peyote, and so at that point you could get peyote legally by mail order, and so it started to circulate around that sort of beat scene. William Burroughs, of course, was on it straight away. He sort of figured out that you could get it, and Ginsberg as well. Yeah, and he had he wrote that it was on a peyote trip in a foggy San Francisco. He saw sort of the big buildings of San Francisco downtown with the lights on, and they looked to him like a huge monster with multiple eyes, and that's where his Moloch comes from. But it's interesting. I mean, the Ginsberg-Burroughs correspondence, even when Burroughs goes to Tangier, they're always sending mescaline to each other, sort of backwards and forwards, and have quite a lot of riffs about it. They were. There were a small number of people during that sort of late 50s beatnik era who were, for whom it was legally available and who were exploring it very enthusiastically, just before the 60s got going.
Right. And then when the 60s gets going, it really seems that LSD kind of, it leads almost to the death of mescaline and the kind of in wider use, I guess. Do you think that's largely due to its kind of it being so much more potent, that it's so much more easy to produce?
Definitely, because that had already happened in sort of in medicine and in clinical and laboratory work. Once you had LSD, which was active at sort of tiny doses. I mean, a gram of mescaline is kind of 3, and a gram of LSD is thousands of doses. So not only was it far more economical to work with LSD, it also seemed likely that, because LSD was working on such a tiny dose, it must be working on a very specific chemical trigger in the brain. So it seemed more scientifically promising as well. And then the same thing happened with when underground chemists got going, in the sort of in the mid 1960s. Ours people working with the Grateful Dead and with Ken Kesey. He started with LSD. So mescaline had this kind of legendary status, I think, in the 60s, because, of course, everybody had read Doors of Perception. And a lot of people who turned on to psychedelics in the early 60s, mescaline was, for a while, easier to get hold of than. So a lot of people had formative peyote or mescaline experiences. But then by the time you get to the mid 1960s, there's no point, trying to make 3 doses of an illegal drug, when with a very similar process you could make thousands of doses of another very similar one. So it pretty much disappears. I think there are quite a lot of references to it, but I've been through all the sort of what became the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, had a very helpful bulletin of all the street seizures through the 60s, and they're on the lookout for mescaline. They don't really find any, and I think by that time you get a lot of stuff that's being sold as mescaline because it's got this kind of legendary cachet. But it's but often it isn't. It's much more likely to be either LSD or something like DOM, some other sort of research chemical.
Right. And actually, I saw you give a talk in 2019 at the Conference Breaking Convention, and in that talk you said that in Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. There's the famous bit in the middle where he takes mescaline, where he's about to kind of really ramp up his kind of drug-induced frenzy. And you said you think that's kind of included because it had this like legendary status that people would have recognized it, but not have taken it themselves.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's so, I love Fear and Loathing, but that's the problem that Thompson sets himself in. That is kind of, you're 5 pages in, you're just in this total drug frenzy. Where do you go from here? And so he kind of drops it in as a really big sort of bomb about halfway through, and then we took the mescaline. But then actually, if you read on, he's not really talking about the mescaline experience. He doesn't really talk about it, and the story just kind of spools on. And he did take mescaline in 1969, and he wrote a really good little short piece about it, and you do see little bits of his description from there popping up in Fear and Loathing. But I think that was really the kind of that's in a way a very good indication of its kind of status and its role in the 60s counterculture, is the fact that Thompson kind of brings it out when he wants to kind of drop the big one, but then it's not really, you don't really get a mescaline experience after that. You get this kind of continuation of this sort of polydrug frenzy.
Right. And then the other major 60s, aspect of mescaline was work of Carlos Castaneda. Is that fair to say that that had a big influence?
Yeah, absolutely enormous. And it's, it's very funny kind of because, like you probably, I read, Castaneda in my teens, about the same time as I read Huxley. I hadn't gone back to it for a long time, and if you kind of read everything that's as much as you can that's sort of been written about the sort of peyote experience, and then read Castaneda's, it really it really bears very little relation to anybody else's. It sounds much more like a kind of DMT trip or something much more sort of intensely hallucinatory. And I think, obviously loads of people have gone back in and looked at those experiences and sort of asked, okay, hang on. So where was Castaneda at the he was with this Don Juan, who was supposedly a Yaqui Indian. Well, Yaqui Indians don't use peyote because it doesn't grow anywhere near them, and so on and so on. I think it's there's lots in the Don Juan books that are kind of drawn from other anthropological studies of different hallucinogens and psychedelics. I think that's so. In that way, you could say that Castaneda was a fraud or a phony, but in another way, I think it was he introduced a lot of very interesting literature to people, and particularly, very much the rhetoric of the 60s, sort of Leary and so on had been, a lot of it around LSD and the idea that this is some huge, great evolutionary leap for humanity. And suddenly we've got this incredible new technology that can enable us to transcend ourselves. And, I think sort of what you get from Castaneda is something saying, well, actually, if you look outside Western modernity, there are lots of other cultures who've been using substances like this and experiences like this and understanding them in a different way. So I think he was very helpful in opening that up. And also, I think in a way it was quite there was a lot of interest in Native American peyote use in the 60s. Not all of which was very culturally sensitive, and which a lot of which the Native American church found very hard to handle or deal with, because they were not they were not what the hippies took them for. They were coming from a very different place. So I think in a way the fact that Castaneda came up with a kind of invented imagined tradition was very helpful, because it gave that for the first generation of white psychedelic seekers a charter, some idea and sort of orientation around, indigenous use, without actually sort of putting it straight on, any particular indigenous group.
Right. And so bringing forward to today, you mentioned, we now have this psychedelic renaissance. And it seems that mescaline is receiving less attention than other psychedelics, as far as I can see. Is that your impression?
Yep. Definitely. I think a lot of the psychedelic renaissance is sort of has been determined by logistics, what's an easy substance to work with, and also to a certain extent PR, when we know that Rick Doblin with MAPS, sort of first started working with MDMA with couples counselling, and then kind of decided to shift to, working with vets with PTSD, because he thought that would be more persuasive to sort of, conservative culture. Roland Griffiths and people have said that when they started working with psilocybin, it was like, it sounded very sciencey, psilocybin. Nobody quite knew it. It wasn't like LSD or MDMA, which had a reputation as a street drug. So I think on all those kind of, more sort of logistical, practical marketing calculations, mescaline is very unattractive, because it's very long acting, about 12 hours. It's got really quite a heavy body load. People who work with it, like the Native American church, have very kind of, beautifully constructed but kind of long and kind of ceremonies that are quite an ordeal. And also, of course, it was because it was there early on, it was one of the very first to be criminalized. It was included in the sort of earliest drug laws, so it's one of the hardest to work around, whereas something like ketamine, for example, is licensed already and you can use it off label more easily than so. Mescaline is kind of unattractive, not because I think it's less useful, but just because it's harder to manage in terms both of the kind of the perception and the licensing, and the the nature of the experience itself.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I know Native American groups have found a lot of benefit in treating alcoholism with mescaline containing cacti, and I think that's being explored clinically now as well.
That's, of course, Humphrey Osmond, when he was working up in Saskatchewan, attended a Native American church ceremony. He was very interested in that. So, that was a very important factor in the very beginning of psychedelic therapy in the 50s, and alcoholism being targeted, by Osmond and then later by Leary as a condition that would be susceptible to treatment with it.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And so maybe to end on, there's this kind of a scientific mystery, I guess, that we haven't really addressed, which is just why mescaline exists, really, it's this chemical that we find in these cacti, but we don't really know why. Would you be able to kind of unpack for the audience kind of what an alkaloid is and why we think it might be there?
Yeah, I mean, alkaloids are chemicals which are produced in plants and cacti for reasons that I think it's fair to say we don't really understand. At least I've never found a botanist who kind of said, "Oh yeah, we understand this now." I mean, some plants contain them, others that don't, that seem quite closely related. There was a theory that they were just because nitrogen based, that there are ways of flushing nitrates out of the system, but there seems to be more going on than that, because they get shuttled around in plants between, roots and leaves and so on. They seem to be being used. If them are psychoactive, not just for us. Humans obviously came along, at a very, very late stage in this process, but for insects and other animals. So we know, for example, that bees are attracted to caffeine-containing plants because they remember where they were better. Because the caffeine boosts their memory, and you have lots of alkaloids that are kind of sort of intoxicating, sort of toxic in some ways and sort of pleasant in others. I mean, if you look at the nightshades, tobacco and daturas and so on, a lot of them are quite toxic and they deter insects, but they're also stimulants and some things like them. So, and I think once you get down to a sort of molecular, sort of micro level with plants, those sort of plant fungal exchange. Obviously, having a certain chemical that other plants don't have is advantageous in some ways, and some animals will evolve to metabolize it and deal with it. And, so it's part of that kind of complex system. And as for mescaline, it's what's odd about it is that you only find it in cacti, as far as we know. And also that the two cacti you find it in, the peyote and the San Pedro, are very, very distantly related. They're on opposite sides of the cactus family tree. One is a tiny little thing that, sort of grows in the desert, and the other's this enormous great column that grows in the mountains. So, I mean, in a way, it would not be surprising if alkaloids like mescaline were everywhere. What's surprising is not that they exist, but that they seem to be, evolve. I mean, mescaline is not a very complicated organic compound. There's all kinds of ways in which it might sort of emerge or develop. So I guess it's not just a sort of mystery. It's a kind of mystery wrapped in an enigma, that we don't quite know what it's doing in the plant, but also we don't know why it isn't much more widely, sort of dispersed through nature.
Right. Thank you so much for your time and for writing this amazing book. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
Oh, great. It's a real pleasure talking to you. I have a website, which is mikej.net. If you just Google Mike J, it pops up, and you'll find my books. I've got a page on the mescaline book, and various articles and stuff. And you can find me on Twitter as well. I don't tweet very much, but that's I guess the website. And I'm now on your YouTube channel, which I'm delighted to be on. I've been really enjoying your work.
Oh, great! Yeah, we're glad to host you here. And I recommend the book Mescaline to anyone.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.